everybody a chance to get set, and then we'll start up here. I'll talk both about education, but I would imagine you're also interested in the casino decision as well, so I'll talk about that right to begin with and then take some questions. Overall, as I mentioned, in terms of the education conference, for us, it's important to to focus on making sure that every child in this state has access to great education, whether it be at a traditional public school, at a charter school, or a private school through a voucher, or maybe even in a homeschool environment. Tonette and I were blessed to have wonderful public schools, and that's where our sons both went to school in Wauwatosa. My nieces are still in public schools. I'm the product of a public school, so talking to the leaders here, the school board members, superintendents, administrators from our public schools, incredibly important. Over the last few years, we've empowered them with the tools that they need to literally run their schools at the local district level, as opposed to being tied up by some of the challenges that they've had in the past. I'm proud of the fact that over the last 4 years that graduation rates have gone up, third grade reading scores have gone up, ACT scores are now the second best in the country. And I believe there are a variety of factors, but one of the biggest of which is now schools have control. The school board people that we elect at the local level, those members now are able to hire and fire based on merit, to pay based on performance, to put the best and the brightest in their classrooms and to keep them there. And I believe that's part of the reason why we've had success over the past 4 years, and we'll build off of that going forward. As I mentioned today, the three big things I talked to the school leaders about was one, the school accountability measures. My hope is, as I mentioned, the state of the state, that the legislature will send me a bill that provides objective and comparable information, that ultimately the final measure of accountability will be once providing that for all schools that receive public money, be it a traditional public school, a charter school, or private school that receives public funds through the voucher program, is that the ultimate form of accountability is leaving that up to the parents. I trust parents. I want them to have the final say, whether it's looking at a public school, a charter school, or a choice school. I believe if there's objective, comparable information provided to parents, they will ultimately make the right decision for their student, for their child, and that ultimately that will encourage schools that are good to continue to attract great students and families. And for those, be it in any of those categories that are challenged, it'll force them to step up or see families choose to move away from those schools and communities choose to take action at the local level. I do not want a statewide bureaucracy to be making those decisions. I want those decisions ultimately left up to the parents. Secondly, and really the second and third points kind of blur together, as I mentioned, career and technical education, extremely important, particularly at a time when our economy, there's an abundance of manufacturing and other skilled trade-related positions available and even more on the horizon. We want to make it easier for school districts to attract the kind of talent they need to teach, particularly in those areas of career and technical education. So as I mentioned yesterday, we're going to be working with DPI and the legislature to provide an alternative way to provide for individuals to get into the teaching profession, as long as they can test and show that they are competent in those areas. The decision to hire still will be left up to the school district, but it'll be giving them one more tool in which to do that. And as I mentioned, we'll be continuing on with incentives that we put in place in the past in terms of dual enrollment, where we have programs where our technical colleges and our high schools work together to provide technical education and career development courses, to provide financial incentives for more people to go into our technical colleges, both through a tuition freeze in high demand, high interest areas, as well as scholarships for some of our top students that traditionally we just provided for those to go on to a 4-year college or university. We're now providing that for 2-year technical colleges as well. And as I mentioned, to try and encourage our school districts to put a greater emphasis, even to the point of recognizing students who graduate as part of their statistics that go to a 2-year as well as to a 4-year college or university and beyond. So that's kind of a highlight of education. You can ask some more questions about that in a moment. Obviously, the other big thing we announced today and want to talk about here for a few minutes is I have informed the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs that I am not approving the application for a casino in Kenosha by the Menominee tribal government. The reason for that is simple. It boils down to what I've said repeatedly was our biggest challenge over the last several months, and that is because of the compacts that were put in place by former Governor Jim Doyle. We believe that the state taxpayers would be exposed in the short term to about $100 million or more in terms of lost revenue, and potentially millions more far beyond that into the future. And then in light of not only current budgetary considerations, but where the state would be in the future, had hoped that we could find a way to avoid that. Had worked on a way to try and avoid that. But in the end, through nearly a year and a half's worth of negotiations with multiple parties involved in this decision, it is clear now that that's something the state's not going to be able to achieve. And therefore, I cannot put the taxpayers of the state on the hook of losing about $100 million or more now, and potentially even more in the future.
What changed on that? I mean, all along you knew that was a possibility. The nominees say that they would cover it. That's been in the play since the beginning. What changed recently to say no?
Well, it's just been clear. We tried to run the clock down as far as we could to a final decision to see if we could find an agreement between the Forest County Potawatomi and the Menominee Tribal Nation. We're not at a point where we can get that. As was mentioned the other day, even when we announced or the administration put out the approval of the Menominee Compact agreement, as the Secretary of Administration mentioned that day, there's still, in our review, not a way to legally guarantee that the state wouldn't be on the hook for about $100 million or more just in the short term, and potentially hundreds of millions of dollars more in the future. They can say that, but there really isn't a legal mechanism for us to guarantee that, and we've seen that thus far. Particularly in the short term, you've already seen that the Potawatomi had withheld a payment. Even in the most optimistic of scenarios, if this had been approved, you're talking several years before the Menominee would be even in a position to do this. And on a long-term basis, there just isn't a guarantee that makes us confident the state wouldn't be on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars.
Representative Barker said you just said no to 5 million tourists and 10,000 jobs.
He can say whatever he wants, but the facts are the facts. The facts are clear. In his county, even before this decision, we've helped through our policies and our direct actions provide literally thousands of jobs to Kenosha County and southeastern Wisconsin in the last couple of years. We're committed to that area. That's one of the areas of most rapid growth, both of companies starting and growing there as well as those coming over the border from Illinois and other places around the world. Kenosha County is doing very well and will be doing very well in the future because of efforts unrelated to this. Certainly the jobs are something we looked at, but again, if you're on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars, that's something that even some of the supporters of a casino acknowledge is a pretty high hurdle. And in the end, we tried to get over it. We spent nearly the full 18 months that we're legally entitled to do. Obviously, that's far less than the 9 years the federal government took to approve the initial application. We did our due diligence, as we owe it to the taxpayers of the state to do, but we just couldn't get past that hurdle.
How disappointed are you that you couldn't do this in 18 months?
Well, we literally, within days after the Bureau of Indian Affairs original announcement back in August, a year and a half ago or so, we had our Secretary of Administration, Mike Hipps, start to meet with all the interested parties. We brought in outside counsel. We had a series of arbitrations as are aligned for or described through the compacts. We sent amendments out to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I don't think anyone can say that we didn't act in good faith to try and get to a point to do this. But in the end, what it really boils down to is there's more than 100 million reasons why we had to make this decision, and they all fall firmly on the lap of former Governor Jim Doyle. If Governor Doyle had not put in place this compact, we'd be having a much different discussion. But because of that, this wasn't just an arbitrary decision we could make starting from an even keel. We had to do it in light of what the compact said.
Some will say a decision, one of the decisions or reasons why will be that you're running for president, that this plays into your presidential politics, and it doesn't look good to expand gambling.
If that's the case, I would have shut it down right off the bat. If it had been done for political reasons, I would have done it a long time ago. The bottom line is, I said all throughout this process, I wasn't going to make this decision based on politics. you all have heard me say this many times before. I told the parties to stop running TV ads. I know you TV stations like that, but I told them it would have no impact whatsoever, and it didn't. We looked at the raw numbers. We tried to get over the hurdle, but as I've been saying for months, and I'm not alone, I mean, editorial boards in Milwaukee and Madison and elsewhere have acknowledged that same concern that I've had for some time, that $100 million or more is really a very difficult, if not impossible, hurdle to get over. We tried to make it work, but in the end, we're at a point where it doesn't, and so we need to move forward.
Is there not a way to do it in the reverse, to say, to approve it, given that there's a, the BIA had rejected the compact that required the $100 million payment, let the lawsuit play out?
Yeah, the problem, though, with what happened there is it rejected the fact that the state wouldn't be, still the concern was the state would be on the hook for that, and we had raised the concern that constitutionally, how could you do that? You can't require one legislature to be obligated by decisions of the previous the previous legislature, and so while there were moving pieces there, the bottom line is legally, in the counsel that was given to us, we still believe that the state is at risk of being exposed to the loss of, in the short term, about $100 million or more, and potentially long term, a far greater amount than just that $100 million.
You got assurances from the Potawatomi that they're now going to pay the payments that they have been withholding?
I believe they will comply with the compact as it is in place. I mean, I haven't talked directly to any of the parties about that specifically. We've been relying on our chief negotiator on all this, Secretary Hipsch, but even as recently as yesterday, he felt confident that if we went back to where things were, again, under the compacts that were approved by Governor Doyle, and that ultimately, that was the decision that they would, they've set that money aside, as you've all reported, in escrow, I believe, and they've been earning interest on it, so they haven't used it for other purposes. They basically set it aside, but I think they did so to make a real and clear point, which is part of our legal observation on this, is that they weren't bluffing. They set the money aside. They'd be not likely to make the next payment, and they wouldn't be making payments into the next fiscal year, the next biennium.
How did this situation bode for, I mean, the Ho-Chunk would like to build an off-reservation casino in the Beloit area as well. How does this decision bode for that?
Well, I think in the specific to the $100 million or so, each compact is different, and so there might not be exactly the same provisions or impact, in the sense that you had the Menominee and the Potawatomi's compact kind of at odds with each other. Other tribes, per my original concern, which was trying to get to consensus amongst all 11, I would imagine it would be hard to get to that in light, at the very least, in light of the Menominee not getting approval here. They'll have to answer themselves whether or not that would mean that they'd forever be against anyone else getting approval. But again, different circumstances. We would treat it on an individual objective basis.
Before you asked for the 6-month extension, you were at this point with us talking about looking for a way to make it happen. That you actually might be surprised when you telling you might be surprised by the decision.
Yeah.
Were you at one point pretty close, thought that this was going to happen, and it dramatically changed?
Well, our hope had been when we made that announcement, made that decision, and then ultimately the public announcement, was that would put pressure on all parties to figure out a way to make this work. That I remember at the time said I wanted to win-win-win. I wanted to win for the potential of jobs in Kenosha. I wanted to win to make sure that we found a way to offset job loss that would occur here in Milwaukee County and Sauk County and Forest County and Dane County. And that, most importantly, I wanted to win to make sure the taxpayers of the state were protected. And so all along we had hoped that there would be a way to do that. That would require agreements between both the Menominee and particularly the Potawatomi. At that time, I don't remember timing-wise if we had yet announced where we thought we'd reached agreement with the Ho-Chunk, but you saw that was part of our efforts. We had our team work with the Ho-Chunk. We got a preliminary agreement with them that we thought was helpful, but obviously the 800-pound gorilla was right here with the Forest County Potawatomi, and we'd still had held out hope that if we took enough time, if we showed that we were serious about considering this, which we were, that there might be a way for them to say, yeah, if you can help us mitigate would-be losses to them in their operations, there might be a way for them to sign off on agreements that would not put the state at risk.
Is this a done deal? Is there any window here that the Menominee can say, maybe?
My understanding legally, and we'll go back and confirm this, is that from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, once you say no, the only option there for in the future, I believe, is a separate application that they would have to go through the process all over again. I don't believe there's a way that you can go back and alter the decision once it's been made on this application.
You're headed to Iowa tomorrow. What's your message there?
Well, it won't be anything about this. It'll be a completely different message. I won't be talking about this at all. In our message tomorrow, we're going to talk about what we faced 4 years ago here in Wisconsin, how we took on the powerful big government special interests, many of which came from Washington, and how we won, not just at the ballot box 3 times in 4 years, but how we won in terms of reforms, how we took the power away from the big government special interests, put it in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers, tell that story, tell the message of how our reforms are working, again, not just at the ballot box, but how ultimately they're helping improve our schools, they've lowered our property taxes, they've made our government more effective, more efficient, more accountable, and then in turn make the case that as people look to the future, one of the things I hope people in Iowa and elsewhere will look at is a message like that, a powerful message that's new and fresh, it's big and bold, that comes from outside of Washington, and that most importantly is proven to work, I think is a better message than the path we've been heading in the past.
Sounds like you're running for president.
Something we're seriously looking at, and for us, part of the process is trying to discern whether or not we think this is our calling at this time. But in many ways, you all have heard me talk about this before, but in 2009, when Tonette and I thought about getting in the race for governor, we sat down, talked about it, thought about it, ultimately prayed about it. We felt we were called to get in the race for governor at that time because we were worried back then that our sons, Matt and Alex, were going to grow up in a state that wasn't as great as the state we grew up in. I'm proud to say today, many years later, because of our reforms, our state is better for them and their generation than the state that we grew up in. But I also know right now I'm concerned when I look at not just the economy and the state of our finances in our nation's capital, but when I look at things like what's happening in the Middle East and other places around the world, I'm worried, again, for my children and for others like them, that they might not grow up in an America that was as great as the one we grew up in. And as a parent, that's just unacceptable. So that's, to me, part of the decision-making process.
You hired a strategist in Iowa. How does that play into your decision-making process there?
Yeah, as I've said before, I think any of us, be it in government, politics, or I think anybody who's been successful in business and education and media or anywhere else, if you're making a big decision, you don't make it in a vacuum. You make it trying to understand if you were going to do something like this, how would you do it? How would it work? If someone's starting up a company, they don't normally just start out with an idea and not test whether or not they've got a good business plan, and they usually talk to others who've been successful in a similar way, and they try and measure what kind of appetite there is for a business and a product like the one they're potentially putting out there. In the same way, part of what we're doing in Iowa, New Hampshire, and elsewhere is talking about what's important to us, talking about why I'm worried about the future of this country, and more importantly, talking about why what we did here gives me hope that, as I was worried more than 4 years ago, and we turned things around, I'm enough of an optimist that I believe with the right leadership that comes from outside of Washington in particular, because Washington's kind of got that tired, top-down, government knows best, go along to get along mentality. I think in the next few years in this country, if we have new, fresh leadership that builds things, builds the economy and the quality of life in this country from the ground up, I think we have the opportunity to turn this country around. And I'm going to have that discussion with people not only here in Wisconsin, but in places like Iowa and New Hampshire in the coming months. I'll do one more here.
Sort of a two-part question. This is largely a Steve King thing tomorrow in Iowa. Do you now endorse everything Steve King has said about Latinos and other groups?
I haven't now or in the past I haven't had a position on him or anything else. I'm going because it's an opportunity to talk to people in the state of Iowa, a state where I lived in my early childhood till I was in third grade, and a chance to talk to voters there. I think he can speak for himself, but I'm other than potentially, I don't know if he or somebody else is introducing me, my comments are going to be directed at the people of Iowa.
So you, and just to go back to Charles's question, so a day before you're going to Iowa, you're announcing this Potawatomi and Menominee decision. It does look political. You would concede that?
No, I don't think you'll find anybody tomorrow talking about this. What they're going to talk about is what I say tomorrow, and I'm not going to mention this at all.
Thanks.
Great, thanks.